can't express my happiness. I thought, why should I only get to meet you? I should have the chance to let my students, my colleagues also get a So, and this is a joy in university life. This is how we all grew up in universities, that we got serendipitous opportunities to meet scholars and have a chat with them. Apart from the regular lecturing mode, the conversation mode, and I am familiar that we would love to have a conversation with children to any age group, right? Doing philosophy for children as well as for some of us or in those in other part of the continents. So that's the template in which we are having this conversation with a very small group of students because there are classes going on at this hour. Some of these students are also very well familiar with your works, I must say. They have been made to read your work in some of the courses. But also otherwise, I guess they have some fascination for your work. So probably they will come up with their own questions. But before that, I thought I should highlight it, that an opportunity to meet and converse with a scholar is something which stays in our lifelong experience. We might forget about some lectures in the classroom, but this kind of interaction one-to-one we do not forget. And my association with you is also through some of these kind of interactions where you may not have known us, but you had a chat with us as if we have been kindred souls in some fictional kinship network, right? And that is the beauty of scholarship, I would say. And that's the beauty of scholarship that we also see in your work with Professor Gopal Guru. Also in other works that you did alone, one can get a sense that you are interacting with a whole set of this epistemic community around you, right? So in that wake, I thought one should try to slightly underline very briefly that some of us who do social science, like typical social science, our entry to philosophy is slightly circuitous. Like in the name of methodology, in the name of theories, we try to get into bit of philosophy. But that bit of philosophy, when it starts getting too complex, many of us feel slightly uncomfortable too. That I have heard this from some sociology students that we are not the students of philosophy, we are students of sociology, we are students of sociology alone. And my point of defense always is that in the backdrop of anything in social science there is philosophy. So we can only to harm our intellectual growth, we can sideline that part. So how much of philosophy one does, that's entirely an individual volition, but then one can't do away with philosophy. Right? It is philosophy which also helps us take social science forward. The sign of progress in social sciences is due to our engagement with philosophy. And that's where I have always found your work, which have helped us rethink science itself. Very interesting. I mean, before I read Bruno Latour, I had read your book, and also the turn to the epistemological resources in south of hemisphere, and how to utilize those epistemological resources. Some of the philosophers abroad, Indian philosophers located abroad, they were trying to do it at some point of time. I have attempts to develop phenomenology of East, B.K. Matilal and all those, and his students. But then there is a different kind of, something refreshing that comes through your work. And I always felt as a sociology student that the refreshing part was that, you take us to some of those questions which are very close to the heart, sociologist's heart. The questions of disparity, inequality, question of so many such things which are our everyday concern. And that is what finds more articulation in your very intimate kind of dialogue with very hardcore political scientist, political philosopher like Gopal Guru, and that dialogue moves in that, takes it to another level. So this is, and to put it very briefly, I'm sure students have scratched furthermore and they have found a little more in the background. So just to help ourselves put in this broader context of your work, and also anything else which may be about the biographical journey of a scholar, because this is also something very fascinating for me, that you have not been tied down by any one institution. And in our time, that's really a challenge, because we always negotiate with the demands and the constraints of an institution where we are located, and we try to survive. But in that mode of survival, we begin to compromise on our pristine intellectual urges, if I can say so. Right? And that's where I find that some of you, which are disappearing breed, by the way, right? You're rare now. Don't worry, we don't want to put you in the museum, but then it's very hard to find that somebody who would set an institution, would contribute to the institution, would be also independent of the institution in terms of the development progress of scholarship. So that's where I also feel the necessity for ourselves to look at your biographical journey, to understand your biographical journey. So I do not know what kind of questions will come our way, but anyone who has questions, you can get ready with the questions. Before we go to the questions, in case you have some initial thoughts.
Well, I'm really honored to be here today. I'm sorry to slightly delay another talk. I've heard so much about this university. I've never seen it, and it's really nice to come and see this. And of course, I know Dave's work, so I'm always very happy to be part of, to visit sociology departments, because there is a lot, as he said, with my ways of thinking and what my sensibilities are, and to what sociologists like to do. But as you also mentioned, I'm basically a nomad. I don't have institutions, I don't have disciplines, I don't have a job. So, so it gives me that freedom to actually enjoy and learn from others, from different things. So I don't have a stake in saying, this is what I stand for, So that exploration is something which has been central to my work that I've been doing. And as you said, working with children has been a great learning experience for me, I think. A lot of what you said about is also a reflection on what is happening to philosophy today. I mean, the relevance of philosophy, for example. I was a little bit worried when he said I make students read your book. So I was, so many times when students get back and say, oh God, you're forced to read more. I hope it is not that bad. But, the point is, there is a crisis about philosophy itself. So I think that is something which, if there is somebody who wants to talk about it, we have to talk about what is philosophy. I think part of the crisis in philosophy is what is philosophy. It's not about what philosophy. Thank you. No, it's perfect.
It won't be like South Indian coffee.
No, it's perfectly fine. So, I think that question, I'm sure resonates with, in today's world of disciplinaries. What is sociology? What does it mean to do sociology? What does it mean to, I can see, raising this question from not just the global north, global south, but just the Indian north and Indian south, I can tell you it's different. So what is it that we actually mean by saying, what are the resources for sociology? What are the resources for any other different discipline? And who are the constituents of our disciplines? All these are, I think, extremely important questions today. So, thank you all so much for having me over and spending your time to have a conversation. I really look forward to it. You can feel free to say anything you want.
Yeah. So I also have a couple of my colleagues here, Dr. Chudamani Basnet, Dr. Ishika Dey, and then as students who ask questions, probably they can introduce themselves. Yeah. So who would like to go first? So let me begin with my question, which is also a question with which I have engaged intellectually in terms of writing as well as in day-to-day practice in a university, how to maintain that, particularly that epistemological, forget about institution, epistemological autonomy, even though while we are dealing with some of the given canons. Very simply put, basically what I mean to suggest is that, often it happens, even with me, and certainly with a lot of students, that given the fact that these are canons, well established, produced, reproduced over decades and more than half a century, it's very safe to stay on with those canons and not venture any further away. Like, do not step into zones which will be uncomfortable, which will require me to do a little bit of extra in terms of plowing, finding new seeds and all. So better to stay on with the canons in terms of theories, concepts, the lens of way of seeing that comes from those canons. So I also want comfort in my life, and therefore I generally stay on with the canons. But then I also have this dilemma that I'm not probably performing my academic duty well if I stay on with the canons. No matter of what kind of canons which were called pseudoscience by somebody, or canons which are defended as proper science by somebody else. So, but any canon gives me this anxiety. How to still maintain my autonomy while I learn from those canons. I understand that there are various kind of answers, but I would like to hear from you.
Okay, so just to throw this up, because I'm sure these are probably questions which may not matter to you so much within specific departments, but I think this challenge in working with contemporary problems, I do think that we have to figure out what does it mean to belong to a particular tradition. I mean both intellectual tradition, cultural traditions, and that notion of belongingness I do think is an extremely important question. I think in that sense, I don't want to go too much into the biographical bit, but I think I'll connect it since you mentioned that. I think part of the reason why I'm not so tied into particular canons is because of my trajectory. I was a science student, was very interested in philosophy, but didn't have philosophy programs in India when I was studying. And then I formally went to study physics, and then I did philosophy when I was a student doing that. And then I shifted. So for me, entering into questions of, social sciences, etc., came entirely out of my interest. I had no connection. I was not a member of any of your groups. And I'm not even a member of any philosophy departments or, it's just that, I studied, and at a particular period of time, I just started gravitating towards this. And it's very interesting that for me, I often find it very shameful to confess that even when I went to do my PhD, I didn't know much about social science. I was a typical science student. We were all, especially Bangalore is a very science city.
Yeah.
And so I didn't even, I knew something, a little bit about, so I was very interested in literature. So that was the only part which was on the side. But I didn't realize there's a discipline called anthropology, for example, and what kind of things we were doing there and so on. So I think, at one level, for me, the engagement and movement into it was catalyzed by very accidental. When I was a student in physics, I met this girl who was in anthropology. And that's how I knew of anthropology as a discipline, because I was more interested in her than the discipline, Then I realized, there's a discipline called anthropology, and it was a great learning, and it really attracted me. The first time I saw it, I said, really fantastic that people actually do this kind of work. And by then, even philosophy is still so much of, it's still got this academic pretensions of rigor and depth and so on. So that was very much there, which the social sciences did. And then when I came back and joined NIAS, I must share this with all of you because it is a sociology story. One of the institute I joined was National Institute of Advanced Studies, which is a very interesting institute within the Institute of Science campus. It was the last institute started by J.R.D. Tata. And Raja Ramana was a physicist, the nuclear scientist. He was the director. And he had a very interesting model. Both JRD and Ramana decided that regular academic institutions have become academia's ivory tower in the name of, in the words of JRD Tata. And that if academicians don't talk to the public, then there's no point of what they're producing. So he began an institute just for that. So we would have workshops where you would have private, public sector people, various kinds of people would come together. And there was no money in the institute. You know, I don't think they still have it now. It is Tatas didn't know what to do with humanities and so on. What they did with this, they've done everywhere else. Okay, you know, this has been here, right? So they thought, you know, we had all these very interesting people. So Ramana was there, and then the next director of TIFR was a physicist, but who became interested in consciousness was there. They all retired and came, and so they didn't have to worry about something which I realized as a faculty had to worry about, something called scale. You know, like every year, how much do you increase? Do you get HRA? Do you get place to stay? I remember one of those faculty, I mean, all these are really retired, very eminent people. And they said, oh no, that we were asking him, where do you stay in Bangalore if you don't give us a fund? No, I said, we all have houses. You know, they're all very senior people are retired, they have houses. And so it was a very different world in which I came in. But the interesting sociology story was, one of the people who Ramana got was M.N. Srinivas.
Oh.
So it was M.N. Srinivas, Ramana, and only 4-5 people. And for me, a lot of my introduction to sociology, moving away from anthropology, was with M.S. And because we had a, you know, like good South Indian, what should I say, South Indian Brahmins, elite of South Bangalore and Tamil Nadu, etc. One of the most important things in an academic institute was our tiffin, which is like every Wednesday we would have a seminar followed by vadas and bhajis and donas. That is the highlight for our thing. But what that did was every Wednesday we would have this talk by one of us, including MNS and others, and there would be an open discussion. And we were all, I mean, no, when I joined compared to these guys, we were all very junior, there were very 2 or 3 of us. But it's a very different institute which began. So it was actually a very interesting problem for me. It was not a well-established institute. There were no resources at all. The libraries sucked. They didn't have anything. They didn't have money to buy books or journals. But the best part of it is they didn't know what you were doing. So there was no pressure on me to say, okay, we had this vague pressure, what do you publish, what do you write, etc. And it was very difficult, I must say. Because you don't have libraries, you can't publish. You know, now we have far more publication houses in India. In the 90s, there was nothing. And in philosophy, you can't get published as journals. Journals are very few. They publish once in 6 months. And Journal of Philosophy, for example, is such a small one. And they publish, I think, monthly, but they publish 1 or 2 articles. And people who have sent articles 3 years back will then get published. So it's not, nobody's in a hurry, right? So, like somebody told me, you guys are still talking about what somebody said 2000 years back, so what's the hurry in getting publication? But the problem was, being in an academic institute, especially a science institute surrounding us, there's a lot of pressure on what do you publish, how many papers you publish, how many stuff you publish. So, I think in that sense, you know, being part of department, being part of technical campus was never part of the thing. And I think it, for me, I think the only way in which I've been doing work is because problems puzzle me. I'm a puzzle solver. I don't belong to any departments, any disciplines. There is something which seems like a very important puzzle which we don't make sense of. Then you ask, what are the resources I have in order to be able to resolve it? And that's how the entry into different schools of philosophy or, you know, whether into social theory, etc. happened.
So,
Sophia.
my name is Sophia, I'm Kashmir. While you were saying whatever about your life journey, I felt like it's my life journey. I'm from Kashmir and I did my graduation in physics. When I came here, like, I was interested more in philosophy and I thought, okay, philosophy can be read on one's own, but you need physics. You know, physics is maybe the pinnacle of philosophy because these core questions of, you know, philosophy, like consciousness or God or whatever you call it, they might not be answered, you know, if you're not going into what quantum mechanics is saying. And that's the motivation that drove me to Hindu college. But the first lecture I remember, it was like so disheartening. Okay, people are teaching relativity on board, and everybody is kind of, just making notes, and I couldn't make sense of it. And I went to my parents and I was like, I'm not going to do it. I went to Stephen's, there was this person called, I forgot his name now, Ashley something. He had done his physics bachelor's and then he had gone to Oxford for philosophy. I thought I could meet him, but then he was not in town. And then my parents were like, philosophers, who are philosophers? They are crazy people. They just do like this to their hair. There was somebody in the mohalla, and this is where my ethnography self now comes. How does the community look at philosophers? They usually considered mad people who don't make sense and who just wear those shabby clothes and stuff. So my parents had a lot of reservations with me going into that discipline, and ultimately I had to stay, but I was not happy. And I think I did my master's in physics also because I didn't know what else to do. And also my parents wouldn't support. And then I tried to kind of understand, and I don't know, somebody said that, okay, in sociology department, they do have people like Heidegger and people like that, so you go there. I cracked the entrance and I went. The questions that I was asking, I don't know how to put it now that my professors are here, but...
We can disappear if you want.
But those are very, what is phenomenologically space? So these are, I felt like nobody's understanding what I'm trying to do. I did a course from that institute, I forgot the name of that institute, on phenomenology, and there are interesting people like Ponty and others, but when you would want to write about it, I felt like, okay, I don't belong to this discipline, I don't know how to write, maybe I have ADHD, I'm a non-linear, I'm not linear with my thinking, so I felt, I don't know, inferiority kept kind of getting into me, and I finished 6 years of my PhD. I'm yet to write, and I'm not satisfied with what I'm producing because this is not what I wanted to do, right? So that's not coming, all of that reading of Heidegger, I'm not able to assimilate it properly. And I think this is a problem, at one point of time you'll be allowed to do whatever, and this department is basically very different. They do allow, there are very amazing professors, but still, there's a lot that we also need to learn, how do we kind of penetrate into those domains while also being sociologists. Yeah. And the question, so this was just a resonance that I felt with you. What is philosophy? This question is so important because people would sometimes say, oh, this person is not philosophical because his ideological spectrum is different. So a philosopher is not supposed to enter this ideological kind of way. And actually philosophy is different. And then I went into reading Wittgenstein, ended at the preface, couldn't understand. And I had I have my professors here, they'll be like, you have to finish your thesis, just do that first and then get into these debates. But these are very visceral to me. I'll get carried by what did Wittgenstein do. And maybe I'm bored with the project that I started. Right. So then I'm like, okay, philosophy, you have to be coherent with logic maybe because that's why he's getting into set theory and all. And maybe at one point of time I'll have to go back to physics. Learn anew what set theory and game theory and all of that is, and then come and join, I don't know what. So how do you understand philosophy? What is philosophy? How important is logical coherence? Maybe, I don't know. Because then people would say, who's logic?
No, true, and thank you. I think, this is really the central question, okay? And I think philosophers are the only community I have found within India, particularly within India, where the main task seems to be saying why somebody else is not a philosopher.
It proves that.
So don't get mad at all. I'm not exaggerating. Every time it's about, oh, you're not doing philosophy.
Yeah.
They'll be in the same department, that person is not doing philosophy, this person is doing.
Yeah.
I'm like, why are you wasting your time?
Yeah.
And it's philosophers are the only people who will write book, well-known established philosophers will write a book at the end of their career, what is philosophy? Because, you look at so many famous books, including Deleuze's thing, which I find quite problematic. What is philosophy? Because it's like, okay, we have to tell others or we have to tell ourselves.
Yeah.
And the fissure in philosophy departments is too much. Earlier it used to be analytical continental. So Heidegger, so you have all the analytical guys won't think of those people. Okay, great. And the continental think what the analytical people are doing are not philosophy. Oh, what is this logic? This is all about plus, this is all about okay. Then in between you had the Indian philosophy and other philosophy.
Yeah.
So in India that was that was taken care of. They put Indian philosophy in the Sanskrit department. They didn't put the philosophy department. Okay, now there is some kind of a mix. And then they won't consider, you can't talk about Ambedkar or Gandhi within philosophy department, they're not philosophy. Then you can't talk about, which I think is a bigger crime, and that's why I'm very happy to see what this place becomes. And one of the things I've been like preaching, the only thing I've been preaching about in a sense is that why is it that Indian students or students in our Indian universities don't encounter writings from Southeast Asia, South Asia, Japan, Asia and Africa? Why, Heidegger is good. I mean, whatever I've done when I studied philosophy, it wasn't these people because I was this philosophy department there. But as much fun and as rich it is in some sense, why is it that we don't tell our students to read South Korean and Japanese and Chinese and Pakistani writers or Sri Lankan writers? I don't know who are they. I'm not saying the list of people who belong to SAU. I don't know who belongs to SAU. But I'm saying we don't even recognize the world of people who are around us or produce theories or philosophies. Islamic philosophy is such another great contribution in the whole history of science, as you mentioned about physics. Even in the history of Western philosophy, you can't just teach it, you can't have it. Our students don't read it, not because we are not teaching it. Even if it's available in the net, they have no exposure. They don't cite any of them.
Accessibility is also not there.
Accessibility is much more now. I tell you, there is a lot more availability of resources, but still our default goes into these, one specific group of European writers, largely. And it is a fundamental problem, and whether that kind of philosophy would really help. So within philosophy itself, the definition of philosophy is a big challenge. And I don't want to do this, but I think it's useful to also mention that that's the reason why I'm just advertising my next book. It's called Another Story of Philosophy. And the reason I wrote that book is primarily for this reason. One of the most famous books in philosophy is Will Durant's What is Philosophy?
Yeah.
It's so famous that even in India today, you go on the pavement, there'll still be one copy. Along with Sidney Sheldon, Harold Robbins, Will Durant, What is Philosophy? I really haven't met anybody who has read that whole book. I know people have, a lot of people have bought those books. But that book is very interesting. It's just about, if I remember, 9 philosophers from Aristotle, Bacon, and all these people. He has written some coming to it. Okay, great. And I began writing this book after I've been wanting to do this book of saying, what does it mean to think philosophy? What does it mean to do philosophy outside philosophers? What does that actually mean? So, in the second edition of his book, he makes this very interesting point. He says, if there is any lack in my work, he was very surprised that it became so popular. And he mentioned this, I never expected it became very popular. Then he says, if there's any lack in my book, it is that I don't refer to what he calls as Hindu and Chinese philosophies. But in principle, you're saying a very large number of philosophies I didn't mention. And that is the starting point so I've titled my book Another Story of Philosophy. And it is about a way to, so Scroll carried 6 extracts from it a few months back. And hopefully the book will cover the next few months. But the point was to try and see how to then think about what is philosophy first, and secondly, can philosophy ever be defined without its relationship to world, to the nature of human beings, to society, and therefore to other subjects. And for a lot of philosophy departments in India, they don't do, for example, philosophy of science. One would think in a very dominantly scientific society that philosophy departments will have something called philosophy of science. They just don't do it. Philosophy of social science. Why can't social scientists at least? If not, I can understand scientists don't want to do it. And I understand philosophers don't want to do it. I often feel why, as a foundational course, not here, but I'm saying many other places, they don't think philosophy of science. For example, for anthropology students, including people whose committee I was in, I would often say, for example, language, okay? All anthropology students who are there, not in anthropology, today in India, sociology also, Harvard is like that. Everybody's doing fieldwork, everybody's studying, some communities, right? And then they will say they use participant observation, they use this methodology of talking to people, interviewing. They come back with huge data on interviews. Okay, great. And I said, how come you do all of this? How come so much of your methodology is based on the question of conversation and language and analysis of it, without spending 10 minutes on asking what is a philosophy of language? I'm not saying philosophy, what is language? What does it mean to communicate? What are words? What is the theory of meaning? Why is it that your very critical understanding of the nature of language, the experience of language, the theories of meanings of language, different types of questions about various philosophical traditions, why is that not of great concern to all of you? And I'm saying it's a purely, I don't see that as an imposing philosophy to this, because I think philosophical questions are what it is very basic, it will remain the same because it's only asking questions of what is it to be a human being, what is reality, how do we understand the things which we produce, which includes art, language, etc. That's all. Nothing much has changed. The expressions have changed, but the questions of does a word have a meaning? Does a sentence have a meaning? How can words combine together to produce one meaning in a sentence? What has changed in that? It's still as relevant when you're sitting in, maybe in a small place in village, in interview in Kashmir and talking to somebody and getting it in Kashmiri language too. It's the same question. And how then are we going to understand these questions? So I do think philosophy still matters in that, but philosophy departments do. And I really think, I'm not saying this to be critical of philosophy department, I'm just saying it's part of the institutionalization issues. That how much of philosophical thinking is present in all your work is the thematics are there. The question is whether what philosophers have said should matter to you or not. That's a call you have to make, because the thematics are the same, right? So then which philosophers are you going to use? Which one do we think we should use? How do you then decide on choosing that? Those are, I think important questions, and depends on the particular kind of questions, I guess, and the kind of illumination. But it is true that philosophy is as hegemonic a discipline as other disciplines are making. And therefore one has to open that up in order to, and I think it's only because of other disciplines, particularly sociology and anthropology, which can make people do this part. Otherwise they're still going to hide inside books and texts and etymology of words, and as if philosophy has nothing to do with the natural world and making sense of it.
We'll go to another question. You want?
So my name is Pragya, and I am interested in the master's writing very early in the career of sociology. At times when I have a brilliant idea and I want to write it down as my own, be not of any aspect of philosophy. But then 2 days later when I get back to my work, I realize that it is not entirely my own work. It is some 5 other people combined idea that I have penned down as my own. So this kind of dilemma of separating between what is mine and what is shared knowledge or established knowledge. How do we do that?
Okay, let me also confess to what I did once. I did my first book. It's called Transferring the West, and like all my books, they began with one question and answer. And what was answering the question, which was that how, scientific texts are very interesting, like physics. They are not monolinear. It uses many different systems of science. And the question was, you have theories of meaning for monolinear. So how does one sentence mean for but I was curious as to how scientists can read those texts. What is the theory of meaning of a scientific text? Because there are drawings, there are equations, there are pictures, then there will be some English sentences. So I began with that. So what I did is I just sat in a corner and I wrote it. I always, most of the thing, even now a little bit as per the I write in pen and paper, okay? So I used to be a long sheet thing, I went on writing page after page after page. Then I did the whole book. Then I spent the next 6 months doing citations. In a sense, what I did was, because this was something that was very deep to me, it came out of my own empirical practice of science plus what I've done in philosophy, particularly post-structuralism. So I just sat and I thought through it, and maybe there was duplicate, I don't know. So I did the whole thing. Then to make it publishable and also to make it scholarly work, because NIAS didn't have any of the resources. Then I got a fellowship at Simla, so at the Simla Institute. So I came there, great library, great place, sat there, and I just went and got specific references to cite to support what I was saying. But it's still an original work, but it's still supported by other people's work. You know, that balance is only evaluated by others, never by us, unfortunately. You know, somebody else has to say that this work is meaningful, is comparatively new. All that we can do is, and I found it very frustrating because I felt, look, this is the idea I have produced, I have written. Now I have to say that, you know, Wittgenstein said something close to this. And Wittgenstein had nothing to do with it. I didn't read that guy before I wrote that. You know, so it is frustrating, but I think that's the only way in which, you know, at least till a particular time when you can, until you publish other books without citations. And in fact, since you had the picture of the everyday social, there's one chapter which is very subversive, which has no references at all. The belongingness chapter. We wanted it as just as a account of experiential thing, without reference. You know, but to do that and get away with it will take some seniority. Yeah. So, but that is the point. I do agree that's an important thing, but it's a kind of a balance. I think there the clarity of your voice, it should be clear to you what your point is. Forget about others. You know, your voice and your clarity, I think, is far more important than anything else.
Soham has.
So when we talk about, as you were saying, the opening of philosophy, I'm looking for alternative philosophies in societies where we belong.
Yeah.
Where exactly do we search for this? What I mean is, say, for example, we start searching for in case of India, we start searching for them in authoritative Sanskrit texts.
Yeah.
Then we might end up supporting, like, such political ideologies or forces which you don't want to support.
Yeah.
End up in this force of parochialization, becoming a Vishu. Or say, do we search for them in historical folklores? We search for them in popular conversations that we as sociologists, anthropologists often have. And I found that in conversations with people who are not necessarily within the academia, there are certain philosophical systems there which need to be culled out, but they're there. So, I was just thinking, where do we search for this philosophy?
Yeah, okay, there are 2 or 3 very interesting points. Okay, the first point is this parochialism question. I think we are too defensive. I really believe that. You know, there are no more greater parochial nationalist thinkers than your German writers. Kant, Hegel, Husserl, Heidegger. Okay, many of whom I love reading them and I use them. Okay, extremely parochial. There are no more parochial thinkers than British Anglo-American, analytical philosophers, who just don't think anybody other than that small British elite group can do philosophy. Forget about have ever produced philosophy. You could look at the American academia today, they will cite everybody of their own, but they will never cite anybody else. Even if Partho Chatterjee was in India, they wouldn't have cited his book. No, what I'm trying to say is that parochialism, we should not at all worry about parochialism. That people will use you, misuse the, what you call traditions is always going to be there, okay? Look at the example, in Sanskrit philosophical traditions, you have 2 of the most important anti-Brahminical, anti-Vedic, atheistic traditions, which, I'm talking even the Buddhists and the Jainas, who produce their central text in Sanskrit, Nagarjuna, Dharmakirti's work. So we have already within the corpus enough amount, like Charvaka and Sankhya. Sankhya is actually an atheistic text. So what I'm trying to say is that possibility that, so we might go back to them as so-called classical texts, right? But then I've discovered many other things. For example, when I did this for Springer, I did this, co-edited this huge volume on logical thought in India. So drawing from very, many different traditions. So for the first time, we have actually been able to get somebody from Tamil to talk about the Tamil philosophical tradition. And if you talk to the Tamil people in Tamil Nadu, people speak Tamil, right? They have a long tradition of philosophy which is so different from the Sanskritic tradition. There are other subaltern traditions which offer you the resources for philosophy. So here, that's why I come back to the question, what is philosophy? Is philosophy to be defined by a ready-made book which we can all use and appropriate and develop? That's one part of philosophical text. But in my view, philosophy is about themes. You discover philosophy by discovering themes of philosophy, which are common to many different traditions. Anybody who's talking about, so for me, as I mentioned in this book, the central marker of philosophy is the body. All philosophies begin with the body. Okay? All philosophies begin with the discussion of the senses. And you'll have to ask, why senses? Why should philosophy begin with the discussion of the senses? You look at, whether you look at Nyaya, which will begin with, we think of it as a logical school.
Yeah.
The first two verses, you'll enter into how to define the senses. The Sankhya Karika will do it. The Buddhist text, Abhidhamma, will begin immediately with the body and the senses. How to understand the body. So, which means any community which talks about, has some vocabulary for body and senses, you have entered into their philosophy. Once you do that, then you discover that they have a lot of similar terms. Like anybody who's talking about reality, what is real, what kind of things exist in the world, are there spirits, are there space and time, whatever it is, those are philosophical questions that are common. So their answers are potential philosophical answers. So that question of logic which you mentioned is only one tradition of philosophical thinking which will say, how do I justify my whatever position I have? So the distinction between cultural beliefs, let's say in spirits, and then developing a philosophical account of a spirit, whatever the spirit could be, maybe two different things. So there's a different kind of labor involved in that. But the entry into the philosophical moment is already through the body, the senses, and questions about, as I said, reality and engagement and so on. So, and then the other second very important point is, there are no ready-made philosophers, we make philosophers. Philosophers write books. It is the commentators who produce philosophers out of philosophers. If you did not have this extensive commentary on Aristotle and Plato, none of us would be, none of you sociologists, social scientists would be using them. It's possible to use them. And again, there's no question of, we don't think that's parochial, although it's entirely parochial. To believe that no other philosophical tradition is there. Nobody has written about what Aristotle and Plato have done.
Yeah.
It is not true. It's that we have built 2000 years or more than 1000 years of very deep commentary. Everybody has written on these guys. I mean, somebody like, Derrida, Deleuze, who want to write something which is even very critical of certain positions of it, they still go back. And Plato and Aristotle come from very difficult politics. Their politics is extremely problematic. But we don't see that we see that as essential to the foundation of social sciences. So, therefore that's the second point. Where do we build a commentatorial tradition? Philosophy exists in a commentatorial tradition. How do we, and in other words, it's you who make philosophers. You pick up somebody tomorrow and all of you write some papers on it and 20 other people write some books on it, that person becomes a philosopher. If Ambedkar is written enough within philosophy departments over the next 10, 20 years and you have enough work coming out from it, that the commentary will become part of Ambedkar's philosophy, not his original texts. Right? So that is why I say the more the urgency, where are we looking at for the light to understand our own experiences? Who is going to be offering that? Which, if theory is seen as this terrible metaphor of a torchlight shining light on empirical experience, then where is that going to come from? Where are the resources we are going to get? And in the Indian case is the other problem, which is language. We don't have sufficient engagement with language philosophies, language writers. So the reason why these kinds of problems become bigger problems is because you do Indian philosophies or I'm sure every other country's philosophies in English. The moment you do it in English, then you are drawn into a comparison. When you don't need to compare. For example, I'll give you a very simple example, very interesting to me, it was a great learning experience for me. there's been a long fight for many centuries on whether Asian and African philosophies had idea of logic, for example. Logic is one big tussle point. For the Europeans, the colonial Europeans, Asian and African societies could not possess the capacity of logic, reason, and therefore religion also, because in the German view of religion is reason. So you had already logic, reason, mathematics. So when they encountered the texts of mathematics, after all, a lot of mathematics till 16th century went only from India and China. It didn't come from Europe at all. Some of the greatest contributions to mathematics. They said that Indians did not possess mathematics, or Indians and Chinese did not know mathematics. They said there's no tradition of logic and philosophy. That all of us in Asian Africans do not have the capacity for philosophy. Not that we can't do philosophy. Therefore, it's very ironic that we have more PhD thesis on Kant and Wittgenstein in India than anywhere else in the world, which nobody reads. None of those guys read it, quote them, and see that as contributing to the Kantian scholarship, right? So, this larger problem of this question of whether people had these traditions. On the other side of the political spectrum, of course, these guys will say they have everything, right? So, we are caught between the two.
Yeah.
On the one hand, it's like possess even the basic idea of logic, nor the capacity. On the other hand, we did everything. Okay. We are caught in between, And the way, so the response to it is very simple. If you want to show that Indian traditions did logic, so you had, for example, in the major Sanskrit, including Nyaya, which is a logical school, or a Buddhist thing, they have a term called Anuman.
Yeah.
Anuman is a translation for logic. So the first point was, Anuman is not to be translated as logic. That was the problem came only in English language. It's because you translate Anuman as language, logic, or Pramana as epistemology. Then you had all these scholars, Western scholars saying, no, you should not translate it as logic. This is not truly logic. It's not correctly epistemology. You are just using our terms. But it makes no sense at all, because there is no one meaning of logic even within the Western tradition. There are very diverse traditions of logic. The very diverse traditions are very small, first of all. And the second point is, when I was talking to some language scholars, people who are writing in Kannada and Sanskrit also, Kannada mainly, they said, this problem doesn't come to us at all, because we don't have an English word and others are saying this is not logic. For them, we call it Anuman and we keep doing all of it. We do all the analysis of logic within the word Anuman. But so the English language is a very important problem. I think we need to figure out how to understand our intellectual contributions when filtered through language.
So we'll go to Apurva then we'll come to Shami.
So I was going through your work yesterday and I realized that you've also written a novel. And I don't think, so a part of the question is, so how do you see what made you write a novel? And then, because your writings are also not really, they're not obscure, their writings are very accessible. We've talked about it, your work is really very accessible for us to read and also to use and understand. So, how do you see, why did you write a novel? And also, how do you see writing as such? Where does it fit in your, in terms of thinking of philosophy and what you're trying to do?
Okay, good that you asked me this question, because I can do what my publisher always tells me to do and I never do it, because I don't have social media, I don't use any of that. She tells me, wherever you go, please mention your novel. I wouldn't have done it, but since you have asked me, I can mention it. It's about following a prayer, yeah. No, I think for me, novel, to me, writing is the source of my thinking. I think through writing. I don't decide. That's why when you said about writing, I do a lot of writing workshops with PhD students. And that's what I used to do for many years now. And
Sundar sir would use this methodology.
Okay.
I'm so thankful that he circulated this one article called Thinking Through Writing.
Yes.
It's very interesting.
And I think for me, it's only I think while the pen thinks. It writes in all my books, whether it's a novel or philosophy, or my philosophy books, it's one of my favorite books. because it's really made me understand philosophy in a very different manner. It is just I had no clue where I was going to end. I had no clue which character would come, which arguments would come in the philosophy text. It is you have to let language speak. In that sense, very dangerous to invoke him here, but in the sense to let language speak us rather than me speak language. It's a very, very important for me personally, right? Which means that has to come overcoming a psychological obstacle, which is what I often have with my PhD students and myself when people talk about writing. And the psychological obstacle is, and I'm saying this very frankly without any pretentiousness, it is that I don't care if I write shit. I don't care. I tell my students, write mediocre stuff. No, because they tell me, oh my God, they read all this stuff. How can I write like that? I say, no, I know, and I believe what I tell them, and I really believe that, that's why I'm saying that. I say that, look, I read so many books. Let's say some philosophers are all over this. And I say, and then after reading those books, including many novels and all, you find what is there in this book? I'm not saying this about the author. I'm just saying, for me, it's like, what is the big deal in this book? Why can't we be doing that? So what I tell them is, I want to write mediocre stuff. That's all. And once the student, I say this more as psychological. I'm very tough on them and they write something and give it to me, to make sure they don't make some stupid mistakes in various things. That's after they write. The point is that obstacle to just writing that. What I call the first stage of writing, which is just vomiting. Which is very bad, just vomit, sorry, very bad word, in the sense, not a very pleasant association, but that's what it is. You write all of it. The real task of writing comes with the editing.
Yes.
That's where I sit with them and sit and say, what is it to write there? But if they do the first part of vomiting, your thesis is done, your book is done. Because afterwards, it is step-by-step work. That's okay, we know how to do that. So, I think that writing in that sense was my tool to think about the world, right? And I was always very interested in literature, in the sense of writing, and I was looking at so many, influenced by different styles of writing. So to me, writing was not about storytelling, it was about storytelling, but also always exploring some theme. It could be theme of language, it could be something else. And I don't read serious novels. I'm a big fan of just pulp. So I read, spy, detective, murder stories and all that. So that's all I read. And I want to write like that. I want to write philosophy like that. I definitely, if you sit and psychoanalyze my writing, I'm sure a lot of my philosophy writing is influenced by pulp literature writing. Within the domain of philosophy. I mean, they sound very this one, but what I mean by that is, it has a readability.
Yeah.
It has a story. It has I want you to say what is going to happen. Right? That's the kind of fiction I like in that sense. But then I thought, I must also confess, I started writing novels in the 90s when I thought I won't have a job in philosophy. There are no jobs in the country. There are no, and I thought, well, how much you will struggle with these philosophy things, so maybe you can become a writer and get some little bit of money to stay. So I started doing that then, but this following a prayer happened in COVID. It's a point, I think it's a far more mature sense of myself when I wrote it, because it's about a philosophical theme I've been very interested in, about the context of religion, where do prayers go, and it was, I wanted to think through that, and I first wrote one part of it with adults as characters, and it sounded so terrible, I threw it out. When adults ask the question, it doesn't sound good. So I realized, by then I'd been doing this philosophy for children camps. And it had been such a lovely experience for me to work with so many of these tens of 60, 70, 100 students engaging with very serious philosophical questions in a very, very light manner. So I said, if children ask this question, it's very different. And it so happened that I ended up with what I think are the best students I always have, which are girls. So there's 3 girls whose whole story is about what happens when they ask this question. So I don't see it as a philosophical novel. Unlike my other writing, another of my novels will come out in and it's like a detective novel. Not a detective, it's about Bangalore. But it's a cultural story about, again, very women-centered novel. But that is something which is more traditional from already, because I don't want to write philosophy through novels. But I do think that exploring ideas deeply is philosophical anyway. You know, we cannot all escape our training in whatever disciplines we have come from. It comes in different ways. So, to me, the short answer is just that you know, definitely there are various. So I would say, okay, let me put it this way: if you want to really learn what language is and how to think about language, I would read Following a Prayer. Because it's about this question this girl asks, where do prayers go? And she realizes the only answer to that is ask, where do words go? And then she has to find out, the whole society is against her, her teachers don't know, her parents don't know what she's doing, and that the people who are religious think, what a stupid, you can't ask such questions. And just what do words mean? And it's only that can be done. It was actually quite difficult to do in this, not as writing it, but you know, living through it. Because unlike a philosophy book, it doesn't emotionally affect me as much as a novel does. Novel really shakes me up, you know, because this girl goes one day. It begins like a detective novel. She goes missing. It begins with the fact that a 12-year-old child goes missing in the forest and comes back after 3 days, probably disheveled, but stops speaking. She doesn't utter a word. And the whole novel has to be in silence of her silence. How to make sense of her silence, and how to understand the nature of language and religion through that silence. It was the most fun thing I wrote because it's a story, and it was so much more easier than philosophy.
It reminded me of this book, Sophie's World.
No, mine is very different from Sophie's World.
I don't know, I've not read
No,
it.
I'm saying Sophie's World is a introduction, philosophical
There's
text.
a book, this
in that
girl,
sense.
Yeah, it
someone
has that
sent me
clear
letters.
philosophical objective.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this is a story. What I mean by the difference is, when I read the story, the emotional register is very important. That I want you to feel miserable. You know, I want you to feel happy with whatever it is. But philosophy books are like you feel you have learned something. You know, that's.
Also, sir, like, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Again. Just one question. Can we think without language?
Should we do a seminar on it? Workshop? No. Yeah, I am a very much large believer that most of our thoughts are linguistically.
Yeah.
And also there are
Almost all
languages
our thoughts.
that are our mother languages, so we have a poetic self which will be expressed through a particular language, but our philosophy will then be in a different language.
Yeah.
So when we're thinking about language, we also need to maybe get into these.
Absolutely. Yeah. But it is true that they are always linguistically different. Yeah.
So,
Very tiny intervention.
It's so
No.
exciting,
I'm
everybody
really sorry.
feels like.
She had.
Do we imagine God without language? According to your question.
Yeah, and then I wanted to ask, are you a believer? That
Okay.
I get to the.
No, you know what?
tiny intervention. My question, then your answer.
Sure.
Yeah, I will answer that after her.
So, sorry, mediocre rant incoming, but
Mediocre?
rant.
Oh.
Yeah, so but this thing about language, so when I started studying sociology, this word I encountered was research, okay, and
Wow.
the thing about research is in Bengali it's gobeshona, which means to find a cow, and so
To
go,
find a cow.
yes, go plus eshona, yeah, so whenever people talk about research, and when I was doing research, like throughout graduation and even in masters when I was doing research, I was embodying gobeshona, the word, and I was finding a metaphorical cow. And my illustrious supervisors, Dev sir, had said, what have you written? It is a heap of garbage. To me it made perfect sense because cows are in heaps of garbage. And so then, seriously. And then I went back home and I thought, okay, so like the problem with my research is not what I have researched, but how I embody the word research. And then I went through an entire identity crisis of what research is then supposed to mean, because every time I do research I find a cow. And no, it is true. It's like, it is seriously, that is how I envision doing a research. I follow a question called cow or a cow called question or what have you. And then ultimately it leads to a heap of garbage because that's where you find cows. So what my question is, how do you sift a cow from a heap of garbage?
Or why would we think garbage is valueless? Because the cow dung is a very good metaphor again to stick with it. It produces, I'm sure you know this very well, but at least definitely in the south, at least in all rural areas, the most important production is cow dung. It is used to water houses, it is used to cook their food, it is used to put for gobar, it is used to put for growing things, even cause urine, etc. In what I'm trying to say is that the fact that garbage is valueless itself, if you put it on its head, then the question is, like we all do, how to find anything of meaningful value in what has been discarded. A lot of research is that. I'll give you one very interesting old story when we were all grad students. As I said, I was in physics. And that time, somebody once, it was very difficult, very complicated stuff. So once the grad student meeting, one fellow said, you know what, the Russians have done a lot of work. Russians have done a lot of amazing work in sciences. And they have all published, they wrote it in Russian and they published it in some obscure Russian journal, which has been published somewhere and lost. So this guy said, there are a lot of great ideas in lost Russian journals. We should just go take some of those ideas and publish it. What I'm trying to say is, if that was seen as garbage and dumb, there's always, I think, pulling out value from what has been discarded is a very important idea of research. Because you cannot, all of us can't be producing positive value all the time. And the fact that what has been discarded is only from one person's perspective, it is garbage. So from our perspective, the task of research is to be able to give a different framework to it and find ways to extract something from it. I'm not even extending this metaphor too much, but I really believe that that is a very important way to, I do think that's what we often do.
Yeah.
Ability to see what's seemingly not that important and discover something. Very interesting.
First line of first manifestation of any production, creative production, is garbage. And that is, the question is, what do we do with that garbage?
Including the writing, that's what I said, that vomiting part of it, is just to write everything. And then, I'm sure all of us have done this, after we write, we don't want to read what we write, right? Then we say no. But I love the task of editing. I love editing. I can keep on going through it, editing.
Yeah.
After it's done, I can't read my books. I can't read anything.
Yeah.
Okay, that's done.
That
that part of, where when I'm cleaning it up, I'm doing this task of that garbage thing. But okay, done, then it's too boring to read, I may not read. But the point is that doing that is very pleasurable in that sense.
So that's the larger context in which a declaration and acceptance of garbage has to be announced.
Okay.
Anyway, so yes, then
those two answers, for the quick answers to both of you is, okay, it sounds very self-serving, but please read following a prayer. You know why? I'll tell you why. Many times I go and somebody asks me some question and I tell them, look, you know what? I've written a whole book explaining that. Why should I do it in 2 minutes? So, but really that's the challenge about, language and God. When this girl says, she thinks that all gods are lies. And it's because we give names to gods that we are lying. And that's why language is a lie. So she stops speaking not because she can't speak, because she thinks language is a lie.
I'm really curious to read.
Yeah, so now please.
Okay. So we'll take 2 more questions. Okay, Ram.
Sir, today morning, he was listening a lecture of yours. So that was like the craft mirror, and the title was like the craft mirror and the Indian debate of experience and theory. There we have discussed like, so experience comes from the Shudra and the theory comes from the Brahmin. Because like Brahmin have the ability to write theory. So here you are like commenting on that, like, so if you have like first hand experience or like experience and then how you can write in the form of language of others' experience. So if it is the question, then as a ethnographer, so for us who are who go to the field and experience others people and write it. So in that sense, what would be your comment on ethnographic fieldwork and writing and making theory?
Yeah, great, thank you. You know this, the context of what you said arose from Gopal Guru's when he wrote called as empirical Shudras and theoretical Brahmins to suggest that so much of writing representing others has been done by people who don't belong to the Dalits. That's a larger context, right? And so the question therefore raises then who can write about whom, right? And there's a lot of manifestations of this. Like for example, in today's theatre, there are being claims that people who are not blacks, you cannot have a white man acting a black man's role, for example, and so on. There have been various other kind of questions around this. So this has become now the bigger issue. But our own work has changed over time. Even Gopal himself, by the time we finish the book, has various modifications to it. This raises a problem for ethnography. So the first quick answer to yours, and I think that's the essential answer to what we have done there, is to say, it is not wrong in going to the field and living with somebody, doing whatever you want to do. Okay. But once you have written that, what is your ethical relationship with that representation? Yes. We are not saying you cannot write it. What is your ethical relation? In other words, are you presenting them through your eyes? First point. Right? Then you would say, no, I am only presenting whatever they have said in their eyes, etc. Then the question you have to ask is, how do you even understand why you are writing about them? So that became a very important question. Because after Cracked Mirror, we have gone so many places, do so many other things around it. Repeatedly we come down to this question. How to ask questions to theorizing? Because theory has now become something which you are free to think about somebody. I'm very curious about your life, I'll come and read your stuff. So every time we do this thing, even for our students at NIAS before they went field work, who also took my course, the one question I always ask them, I say, well, you know what, the only way for you to be sensitive to what you're doing, you're going into the field, you're going and studying some slum or some tribal thing, great. I tell them, my great desire as an ethnographer is to do what? I want to study rich Bollywood actors. I want to go to Sarukkai Khan's house and stay in his house for 1 year. And he will take care of me. Because these guys go field work, come back and say, these people are so good. I stayed in their house. They shared my food. Okay, great. I want to stay in Sarukkai Khan's house. I want to do field work for 1 year in his lovely, great house with all the benefits, comforts. And then I will write a thing about him. But I said, none of you go to somebody's, you do not write about people who are higher in hierarchy. You don't do that largely. I'm not saying, of course, a lot of ethnography has gone through great changes. It also has gone through changes on how you share your authorship of what you write. That's another big question, right? So we write about them and we go off, we write a book or paper or get a thesis. Yeah. And though many times those people don't even know what you're written about. Yes. I remember one field worker telling me, she said, they asked me, can you please tell me what it is? And if you send them your thesis, they are not going to read it. Yes. It's so difficult for you yourself to read it. So you send it to them with all your thing, they know what have you written. So then is there ethical responsibility on you to write, to tell them what you have written about them? Most of the fieldwork people go in and go off after their 1 year fieldwork and then they get the PhD and they go away, right? They don't go back and tell them, look, this is what we have written about you. Yeah. Is this okay, not okay? I mean, that's a second issue, not even okay, not okay. They don't even know what you have done with them. We have just worked on their goodness of heart to pursue our intellectual interests. So there the fundamental ethical question was, why do you want to write about somebody? Why should you want to write about Dalit communities? Why do you want to write about tribal communities? I'm not saying it's unfair. I'm just posing the question. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying that sensitization in you is the first step towards going there. Yes. Because then you will have to explain to them, I'm doing this for the following reasons. I want to work with you, whatever it is. But it makes you answerable to them. And it makes you sure that we are not presenting them in a particular way for other people, for my benefit. So that is really the empirical show, the theoretical Brahmin question came as a problem of representation. If if we have other ways of engaging with this question, then that is very important. That I am never speaking for others. That's another thing which Gopal always used to say. I learned a lot from him on that. That even when we write about any of these things, you are never speaking on behalf of them. Like it happens when suppose you write about a particular area, right? And you become a specialist. Then the government will be calling you for discussing on what they should do in that village. You will be living in Delhi, but you wrote a thesis about that. But then all the discussion, debates, policies, they will be calling you, not them. So those kinds of sensitivity to that is, I think, what our real training in ethnography should be like. And I'm sure you do all of that. I'm saying something is very redundant to all of you, but I'm just adding in the context of what you're saying. And therefore, we also raise this problem in the book, which I think is important. What is the ethics of theorizing?
Yes.
And that's why I come back to the question. Can we choose anybody, just because I want to choose Heidegger, because somebody thinks it's very fun, should I be using Heidegger to represent my world? Because theory is representation, no. You're giving framework to understand our experiences through theoretical categories. And every category which, let's say, the Germans have produced, or the French or the Americans have produced, comes from their experiences, right? So, we have to take that into account. Is there an ethics of theorizing? So, how do we do that?
Okay, we'll have last. I understand you have another commitment.
No, but I have, but I can, if you can wait for the thing, if you can delay the cab, it's okay.
We can delay the cab. Okay, so then, yeah. Okay.
Please go.
Yes, please go ahead.
Hello, sir. I'm a master's student in JNU, second semester. We have got your book, Everyday Social Foreign Assignments. So we are very new into reading. So I just want to know how to approach to that book. We have gotten 3 chapters to read and write an essay using modalities of caste or religion or racism or something. So I just want to know how to approach to that book, how to start reading.
So,
Part of an assignment, no?
Yeah.
My question is kind in continuation with what she's asking. I'm Antara, doing my PhD. So you are currently in a room filled with sociologists, and caste has been a topic which has been worked upon a lot by sociologists or people coming from anthropology. And today's lecture was titled as Philosophy Matters in Social Sciences. So in the light of her question, and the fact that you decided to write something on caste, how was it different philosophically? What was that philosophical element you think that probably sociologists had not probably looked at? So,
okay, great. You're also taking me, so it'll be incriminating me.
should I stop?
No, I said nothing. I've been discarded from by everybody, so it doesn't matter.
You're more liberated.
You're more liberated now, yeah.
No, I think, okay, so see that, as I said, my interest in sociology has been because I'm surrounded, as a writer, for me, society was very important, people are very important. I think my sensitivity to that comes from literature and my interest in writing rather directly on the discipline. And I always find sociology as a discipline, with this whole question of natural science, methodology, etc., actually to be a bit boring, because I've been writing a lot on philosophy of science, and we know from philosophy of science that science is far more complex and far more creative than social science understands science to be.
Right.
In fact, one of my critiques of social science community is you people are not taking a critique of science seriously enough. That therefore science becomes an idealized model, which social science students I find are a little bit intimidated by science thing. Like somebody will say, oh, something in mathematics, or you don't know how scientists do, and you just keep quiet and say, okay, maybe they're right.
Yes.
I think therefore the liberation of social science actually happens first in understanding how does science work, including the symbolic thing. Everybody gets scared of maths, and they may have this joke, right? You do social science because you're bad at maths, and they still continue this.
Yes.
No, it's a terrible thing. I think now it's offensive. Somebody should say that, as an offensive joke, we should stop making jokes on people. They should stop making this joke that social science students are not, they're the worst students in class who could do mathematics. So one of the things which I like to do with social science students is to actually teach maths. not in the way you teach maths like maths, but
Yes.
foundation of what is mathematics.
Exactly.
It is basically philosophy of maths. You know, so that you are empowered by that, right? So,
Right.
so why I'm saying that is social science methodology is all this kind of issue. My first entry into the caste question actually came from M. Srinivas. He gave a talk at NIAS on Sanskritization. He took a stock of it, by the 90s, so he just spoke about it, Westernization, and he said something. Then I was listening to him and I said, you know what, this really reminds me of a question which I had often had about economics. Economics uses a lot of mathematics.
Yes.
You know, within social sciences, it thinks it's better than all of
Yes.
right? And it uses mathematics as a form of Sanskritizing itself. That was my insight. And I was listening to it and I said, oh, you know what, I'm going to go write a piece on this.
Right.
So I called it epistemological Sanskritization. How the use of mathematics in different disciplines is to push yourself up in the hierarchy. It's like putting sacred thread.
Yes.
So you do that and then everybody thinks, oh wow, mathematics. So they think economics is a higher thing.
Yes.
So that then there was published in EBW. That was my first thing really into the so-called domain of sociology. Not sociology, but But as I said, I didn't find social theory. See, for me, sociology is stuck between two disciplines which I straddle. One is natural science, which it wants to imitate in a vague way some methodology. Other is philosophy, which is the foundation for all this theory.
Yes.
It's neither doing philosophy nor is it doing natural science. It's far more creative,
Yes.
right? So it's like it happens to everything which imitates. You are so much bothered with imitating that you don't have the freedom of the original.
Right.
Science is, it does things completely absurdly. It takes concepts and throws them out. It can take any concept, modify them, change them out, right? But so if you are modeling yourself on that, you don't do any of that. So that was an issue for me in general. Then when Gopal's thing came up, and there's a long, very interesting story about how it all came out, response and my response to it, etc. Then my larger engagement with the social sciences actually began. In that sense, the question about larger question engagement with sociology and that. And there, when the question of caste, when I wrote this untouchable, so the Dalit question that cracked me the first part, is response to his point about, who can write about Dalits. That response I had written and, whatever it came out. But then I realized that Gopal was a great interlocutor. I rarely found somebody in academics who can just, I should also share this thing with you. When I'd seen his paper, I was visiting Simla Institute on holiday, and then I was sitting there, I'd read this paper, and then suddenly it struck me that this is so much of philosophical question in this, about lived experience.
Yes.
So I sat there and I wrote it, just sitting on that place. Then I forgot about it because, you see, Gopal is asking a moral question in his paper. How can a non-Dalit write about Dalits? So I wrote a piece, I am not a Dalit. And I asked myself after writing it, what moral right I have to write about this? And I kept it aside. I didn't know Gopal, I didn't know any of these people because I live in Bangalore and all the great guys are in Delhi. So then Sanil had organized an IIT Delhi a conference on Ababa Mass.
Okay.
So I came for that and Gopal was also there. And I still remember we were going down in the lift and then Gopal said, he started introducing me, said, oh, it's Gopal. I said, oh, it's very nice to meet you. I just wrote a response to your thing some 6 months back or whatever, 6 months back. But, you have raised this question in such a way that I can't answer it also.
Okay.
He said, no, you should publish it. You should send it for publication. Why are you keeping it? I said, no, this is the question. And what do you think? He said, he was actually quite upset that nobody had responded. He said that, I'm raising this question and all the social scientists are keeping quiet. So, and he said, no, whatever it is you want to say, they agree, not agree, we should do it. So that's how, in that sense that moral position became tenable for me to say, okay, now I can do that. And that's what happened. But by then, I had already been thinking of some very interesting question on caste, based on this question of untouchability. And this conflict, this very contradictory position of untouchability among Brahmins. And so, in trying to make sense of that, so this is, in a sense, why institutions also produce intellectual products. I wouldn't have written any of this. Cracked Mirror wouldn't have come after this piece was done on Dalits. then Gopal had a meeting in JNU on caste, and he told me to present this paper with the caste, the Dalit paper on that. I told him, no, I think this question of what is untouchability is getting to be very fascinating. I'll come and talk about it then. So I wrote that piece for that. So, you know, in that sense, it was because of that kind of an institutional engagement which we started discussing. And so when I wrote this untouchability thing, I was very curious. Like I said, all my work is just one problem and trying to face it, right? So I went to look for how do you define untouchability. I went and looked at various texts and say, where is this philosophical question? What have philosophers written about? So Ambedkar, of course, Untouchable is a great book. You read all of that, everything was done. I saw a lot of history, I read a lot of sociologists on that. Very important. I'm not, saying anything about it. They've thought a lot about it and all that. But I said, why are they not asking the question, what in essence is the concept of untouchability? What allows the concept to survive a social reality, a social fact, if you like, independent of whatever kinds of changes which happen in society? How to think about it. So for me, to think about it philosophically was very simple. Like I was telling you, to think philosophically, go back to the body and the sense. So I went back to the roots of the idea. What is it to touch? And then I discovered that the reason I went into Indian philosophy there is not because I wanted to go to Indian philosophy tradition, because it's such fantastic work on the idea of body, touch, water. You know how much of wonderful work is there on water? And they're all sociological because they're about how it influences each of our reaction with each other, how societies are formed around these concepts of touch, contact, water, food, etc. So that's how the whole formulation started, And I felt that time that philosophy in social theory, the use of philosophy in social theory, has really not been able to draw upon, the intellectual traditions of the places from which experiences were coming from. The only thing I'd seen famously in sociology was Kim McMarriott, the dual instead of the individual. There he uses some Samkhya, something. I went through it, it was So, but there's nothing else to be able to say. So the reason of going into Indian thought is not suddenly as if Indian because whatever it is, but because it is their lived reality, and I wanted to see what is it that made you produce that reality. And you realize it is that metaphysics, that philosophical foundations has gone into our cultural practice. See, the reason we're doing philosophy is not because somebody wrote a text on it. All those beliefs about body, skin, water are part of our day-to-day practice. What is happening in Kumbh Mela is a reflection of the text of Buddhism, Nyaya, Vedantic debates. So that gave me an explanation why social processes don't change, why it is so difficult to remove caste and untouchability. Because they have been taught not as social norms and rules, they have been inscribed into our metaphysical foundations of what we are as human beings. That's the fight. So that's why for us the question of ethical action in theory is to break that background. Because without it you can produce various, you do the manual scavenging law and it's still, you do SC/ST Atrocities Act, nothing changes. So why? Because that kind of a metaphysical foundation is present. So how do we deal? So to me, that kind of philosophical thinking, where to do philosophy is not from particular philosophical ideology or doctrine. If you have to put Buddhist and Nyaya together, they both hate each other, they abuse each other. But if it is going to help us make sense of the world, put them along with Wittgenstein, put them, even with Heidegger, whatever it is, can it resolve our urgent social concerns? Can it give insights into people? Suddenly say, I can look at social processes this way. That's my only point. That is, philosophy is about an active way of thinking and doing, not about. And therefore, we will use what we want. I don't care if people say I'm doing Indian philosophy, I'm not doing philosophy, it doesn't matter. It's about ideas which we want to use and try and see if we can make some small difference somewhere. That's the whole point. And therefore, the easiest way to read the everyday social is actually to, one of the strategies of reading which I often teach about reading is to not read what the author is saying. Don't have any respect to Gopal or me. Don't even think that we are saying something really profound. you will have to read us with a lot of suspicion. You have to read us by saying, are they saying, does it seem reasonable? You know, I think the reason is the moment you enter into it with suspicion towards what we are saying, you will answer it yourself. And in the end you may agree, oh yeah, it's great, I understood this. But you will have to enter into it not trying to discover what we have said. Trying to discover in your mind whether that problem makes sense to you. We may say a lot about, you know, social touch, social side, you know, that struck us at that time. That we don't, that even senses are not, senses are sociological in character, they are not individual. You know, that's a big thing now in sensory studies and I'm very attracted to it. Okay, senses are sociological. Then you will have to ask the question not whether we are saying that, whether it matters to you, whether you think it's right. Which means you are always suspicious, skeptical about what we are saying. You know, these guys are bullshitting. Okay, let me see. Could it be like that? Could senses be like that? Could touch be like that? Then you will only develop the answers. You don't have, in fact, one of the things I often tell people about reading, anticipate what the author is saying. If you don't try and anticipate, you know, then you are, whatever I say, you are waiting for me to say that. You should, if you have read me, if you have understood my style of thinking in what we write, then you say, okay, they are saying this now. I can guess that this is what they may come to. You may be wrong, it doesn't matter, but that's a habit of guessing what I might say, will already make you a very active reader. You know? And once you put it into your own experience and see the same thing, you know, you will write something different. You will start doing completely looking at it different. And you should have the freedom to interpret it in the way you want. That's the crucial thing.
Okay, so I understand it's very cruel from me to cut this conversation short. Yeah, you can go on and everybody is gaining a lot. But I will cut it short now on the promise that next time, whenever you are in Delhi, you will be generous with us.
No, definitely. Just that,
Yeah.
have to put that on.
Yeah. So thanks a lot.
No, thank you.
Yeah, and I'm sure many of them will get back to you
Sure.
through email and all.
Anytime, please speak. We also do something called barefoot philosophers. It's some kind of initiative work that's we don't. It's not a, not an official organization. It's not registered and so on. We just go teach children do other things. Mainly is to make students independent learners, not get threatened by teachers, not get threatened by schools, and to overcome all of that and become teachers like us. Become students. So anything we